All right, sorry, let me just share my screen real quick. Is this working? Try that and play. Just want to confirm that everyone can see my presentation, Amanda. You can just like say yes or no.
Yes.
Awesome, great. Cool. So this talk will be about building and releasing a CakePHP plugin. My name is Jose Diaz-Gonzalez. I'm on the core team. So what is this talk about? Unfortunately, I won't be going into too much code, as I don't think that makes for an interesting talk. I would probably also fall asleep, which maybe isn't good for the talk. Mark, you're distracting me. Your notifications show up on my iPad, actually. Um, so there will be some references to CakePHP. So I apologize in advance if you were hoping for a different framework. I'll also reference some other frameworks as well for the CakePHP haters that are tuning in. Finally, I apologize in advance for the lack of presentation transitions. I spent all of the animation budget on design work. So why wouldn't we build a plugin? In what cases does it make sense to keep code within your application? And why should you just stop listening to the rest of this talk? I'll go over that in the next couple of slides. So the first thing is, one thing I see happen very often is that folks create plugins just to create plugins. They extract logic from the main application, but the plugin never actually leaves the code base. Plugins are a great way to separate business concerns, but more importantly, they're a great way to share code. Sharing code can mean a couple different things. One, you can, a very popular way is open sourcing, right? And that's something that I think most people listening in are familiar with. Everyone who has used CakeBake before has generated an app that uses a plugin, and most people have likely installed one or more open source plugins from either the plugin site or from the awesome CakePHP list. Another way of sharing code is to share code internally between applications. So this is more common for companies that tend to consult on the same kind of application and maybe wish to reduce the amount of work necessary between customers. It's also something that happens fairly often at companies that provide, maybe a business product or a software as a service made up of a set of services, microservices or otherwise, where each service is a new app that may inherit some of the same functionality. Lastly, you can share code via commercial packages. This is something that's been attempted a few times in the CakePHP community in the past, but not without too much success, or not with too much success. I do think it's only really possible for very complex plugins, such as maybe a customizable backend admin panel, or for organizations that have quite a few different plugins to sell. In particular, Cartalist is a good example of a company that sells a library of commercial packages. Uh, and it's something that I think other people can sort of replicate as a pattern. And definitely, if you decide to go down this path, I hope that you recoup your invested time and effort. That said, if you're not sharing code, plugin creation and maintenance can cause extra, really unnecessary overhead in developing your application, and I wouldn't really recommend it. If your code isn't modular, maybe it shouldn't be a plugin, right? Code that can't be reused is really not a great candidate for pluginizing. For instance, if you're creating a plugin that exposes a data source for a database used in a specific industry and really nowhere else, where CakePHP maybe isn't prevalent and maybe you're the only user, maybe that's not a great use of your time. You're probably just better suited to having that be a class within your application. Additionally, while the process of making code modular is interesting, it maybe also isn't necessarily a great use of your time. In particular, if you don't mean to share the code, whether that's internally, via commercial avenues or via OSS, maybe you don't need to spend billable hours on it. As an extension of non-modular code that contains business logic is often not a great candidate for pluginizing. In many cases, this may be just a single file, in which case, why are you adding the overhead of plugin loading and referencing for that class? Oftentimes, this sort of code will never make it outside of a given code base, let alone your organization, in which case maybe it's better suited to staying within the app. When I think about this particular reason, I like to think about whether the code is useful in a couple of different contexts. Is this something that would be a feature in an issue tracker, right? Would a content management system utilize this plugin, or could you think of a way to add it to an online store? So if it's in one of those three patterns, then maybe it's something that you can use. If the above types of software can use it, and it's not something tied to your business, your specific business, and is a good candidate to turn into a plugin. One exception here, and I actually had to add this right at the end of the last talk, is versioning of web APIs and sunsetting old versions. Having an old API be a plugin means that you can kind of maintain both of them simultaneously, right? So you have your old version sitting alongside in the same code base. Um, Again, nothing that I've said in this talk is gospel, and I'd love it if everyone could keep that in mind as they're making decisions as to what they should do with their code and whether they should pluginize it or not. One thing to think about is, is this a generic class that can be used in any framework, or maybe without a framework? In these cases, maybe it's better to create a generic composer package and use it directly. Tying things to CakePHP just because it's the best framework and all other frameworks are pale limitations isn't always the right choice, and will certainly decrease the usage of your package. My favorite example of this is actually the collection class. We have this in the Cake core, and it probably didn't need to be a core class or even a core plugin. You'll actually see this implemented, this class implemented as standalone libraries or features of other frameworks. If a class or a plugin could have been a language feature, then maybe it's not a great plugin idea. That aside, yes, we wrote our own collection class. It is not a language core feature, and we did need it for features within the framework, so here we are. Um, Maybe you're fine with it being tied to CakePHP, this utility class, which really works great if you're only a developer, right? And then, of course, go ahead, write a plugin. Unfortunately, for larger frameworks or for larger organizations, frameworks change and evolve over time as you go from Cake 1, Cake 2, Cake 3, Cake 4, whatever, or even between one framework to another. And maybe someday you find yourself needing this utility in another application that isn't using CakePHP, or maybe even isn't using a framework. In that case, it probably would have been better to just keep it standalone, since there wasn't really anything tying it to CakePHP itself. Cool. So I guess what are good candidates for plugins? In the past, I would actually go to other frameworks and take inspiration for features and functionality that could be in CakePHP, right? Many of the ideas that made it into Cake core were actually inspired by frameworks such as Django, Flask, Rails, Symfony, etc. I do think that it makes sense to look around what other people are doing, and sometimes it does mean begrudgingly accepting the notion that some other framework does something CakePHP does not. I also think it means that we can do it better, so it's less stealing and more borrowing and enhancing, right? So framework extensions, easy things to build as new plugins are adapters to existing functionality. CakePHP was built with the idea of batteries included, but replaceable. And so you'll see this if you've ever attempted to build a new data source for something we didn't have in the core, such as Elasticsearch or MongoDB. And the same idea exists for like mail transports, where you can use Amazon SES or Mailgun as opposed to just like SMTP, which we ship in the core, auth adapters, etc. This even extends to some of our inner classes, such as data source column types. So potentially you could add JSONB data source type or something like that. While we do try to include a wide range of adapters and sort of extensions to things in the core, you're always welcome to build your own, and maybe someday they'll land in the core. One other area I think is useful is code generation, and I think that makes a lot of sense to sort of extend CakePHP. Custom baked plugins to generate new files, maybe that are like application specific, or pretty good use of your time, or maybe something to extend or enhance existing templates to reduce the amount of time it takes to write code. Every release of CakePHP makes this a little bit easier. So in the past, we've moved from PHP inline templating to Jinja templating, or we've added the ability to create your own custom bake functionality. And I always find myself writing a new bake plugin for functionality I wish was in the core, but I couldn't get Jose Lorenzo to write tests for. Finally, if the core is missing some functionality that is common in other frameworks, that's a good chance or opportunity for you to start working on something great. There have been a ton of file upload plugins. I personally worked on 3 or 4 of them. And there are other areas where the core team either hasn't had a time to develop a great implementation, or isn't interested in maintaining or developing something. We're not gods. We break the build. And I definitely think that this is a neat way to improve the ecosystem. I borrow a lot of ideas, and I actually look at the documentation for other frameworks pretty often, right? So a couple examples: Django, Flask, Laravel, Rails, Symfony. It's not just because I'm a masochist and I like looking at other frameworks that aren't as good as CakePHP, but I think there are some generally interesting ideas coming out of those communities. Sometimes they have the best implementation for a feature CakePHP already has, or maybe they expose a new pattern or a way of doing something useful that will unlock new use cases for our users. Sometimes it's even some things that I've never really thought were a problem or I've never had as a problem, right? I definitely do encourage people to also look at the major and minor release notes for other frameworks. This is probably the best place for you to borrow ideas for your application or to develop as plugins for CakePHP in general. If you're looking at a good way to contribute to CakePHP, this is also maybe a good way for you to produce blog content. But in particular, this was actually something that I did for the email preview plugin I did a couple of years ago. This is an idea that I stole from the Rails community that eventually made its way into the debug kit. They actually had this, I believe, in Rails 4, maybe 5. And I wrote a blog post for this. It ended up being actually very useful for me later on as I was working on an email heavy application and hated sending myself emails in order to test how things looked during the design process. And then eventually it made its way into debug kit. So again, it is something that you can do, look at other frameworks, either the documentation or the release notes. So how do we release plugins? I think there are a few things that you need to do in order for folks to feel comfortable with using your plugin, right? Writing tests. I think this one's pretty easy. You definitely want to have test coverage for your plugin code. It's pretty straightforward, but I'll go into explanation. Plugins usually install their one or more code bases with varying needs. Even the Cake core, like we have a framework, but there are many different types of applications that people write on top of it. If a plugin doesn't have tests and then the underlying implementation breaks functionality during the regular developing of the plugin, then tests are a good way to say, hey, I didn't expect anyone to use it that way, right? And maybe you need to add a test to cover that. Tests are always evolving, and I don't think are ever complete. For the core framework functionality, the core team strives for about 90% test coverage where possible. Obviously, more is better, but it's not always possible or not always feasible, right? I think this test coverage enables us to at least cover what we consider a public API usage, right? So what end users will use, or what other software developers of plugins or their own apps will use, and gives us confidence to make sweeping changes and still be mostly backwards compatible, right? So you'll see that many of the tests have stayed between each of the major releases with maybe a couple minor changes in syntax or additions in functionality. This is actually why we have a test suite that's so massive, because we have a ton of use cases that have been contributed over the past decade, right? And if in doubt, I always ask Jose Lorenzo to write tests for me. He's always written mine, and it's worked out great so far. So if you have any problems, just go to him. I would also, when you're releasing plugins, use Semver, semantic versioning. I try to use it for all of my plugins. It's a good way to announce to people that, one, I'm either fixing a bug, which results in a patch release. I'm adding a feature, which results in either a patch or a minor release, depending on the size of the feature. Or I'm changing how things work on a global scale, and you might need to edit the way in which you use my plugin in your code base, in which case that would be a major release. By using semantic versioning, I can avoid issues where someone says I broke their code in cases where I really didn't mean to, right? Test coverage can also give me confidence in the type of release that I'm making. I'll know that it's a patch release if I'm just fixing a bug, or if it's a major release if I'm changing how you use the plugin. And this overall helps me reduce maintenance burden, because issues will come in, people will be using the right version, they won't be complaining about the fact that I broke anything. Tagging a release is actually pretty critical. Without a release, I kind of consider all code to be fluid and implementations non-static. Certainly, if something hasn't ever had a release, then you can definitely use it in your code base, but maybe it'll change and that won't be good. Folks should also definitely 100% not try to depend on non-tagged releases, specifically branches, as there's really no guarantee that the implementation will be the same 1 year from now or 2 years from now, or even a week from now. For people using Git, simply adding a Git tag is good enough. You don't have to fiddle with versions in files such as .semfir or compose.json, as I think that adds overhead to the release process and makes it less likely that you'll make a release. The fewer steps in your release process, the better for your overall release cadence. Finally, as an aside, please distribute your code on packages.org as composer packages when releasing open source code. The Git repository is great, but really not the be-all end-all. For commercial or private packages, you can continue referencing a Git repository or use software such as Status to distribute that code. Cool. So finally, I'd like to end this talk with a small section on the CakePHP Queue plugin. This is something that I thought was a long time coming and had done a ton of background work over the years. So in the case of the queuing plugin, having a backend that contains one of the things that went well was having a backend that contains adapters for common queuing systems, and that was key to CakePHP integration. In the past, there was a ton of interest internally on providing adapters for real-world messaging systems, such as RabbitMQ, while still keeping the implementation simple enough for Redis, or at worst, SQL-like queues or back queues. We also wanted to set folks off on the right path with something that was both well-tested and had uses outside of CakePHP. Maintaining a new framework is new framework features is a huge burden, something that we wanted to generally avoid. In this area, Queue interop is actually like a great complement to the CakePHP adapter system that we have and fit well with our batteries included but replaceable mindset. Additionally, this is a feature that is common amongst other frameworks. Rails has had this for years with ActiveJob. Symfony has commands. The Python world has Celery and RQ. Background messaging is a common feature for almost every framework, built in or otherwise, and is a common requirement for many applications. It's even something that we recommend in our docs for workarounds for long-running commands. I'd say that the ideas in our particular implementation have been around for quite a while now, right? We've seen it in PHP Rescue, in QCDA, and CakeQ, and bringing something more generic that followed some of the patterns in the core made a ton of sense. Unfortunately, I think this process hasn't been super great overall. The plugin has existed in some fashion before. Multiple core devs, including Mark Scherer, have written great plugins in this space. Could we have reused something from the past versus reinventing the wheel? Perhaps extending the plugin would have resulted in a better result. This is always something to think about before diving into plugin development, and certainly before writing your own plugins, I would recommend checking the awesome CakePHP list before starting a new plugin. I think in particular, there were some other early ideas that around queuing an event were both confusing to end users and not actually necessary. I think it's important to reduce the scope of code to things that are absolutely necessary and nothing more, both to decrease the maintenance burden on that, but also the cognitive overhead of use, right? We certainly don't want to add features that are confusing to our users, while at the same time making it to be more work for us to maintain. Additionally, I was unable to convince certain people to write more tests for me. We're still at not yet quite at 50% coverage, which, as I mentioned before, at least on the core team, we try to go for a 90% code coverage. Certainly, if that's not a requirement for you, for your organization, you can go maybe without tests, and that's fine. But that's just something to think about, especially as you're open sourcing something and maybe you want to share your code or even internally. And I guess crucially, the package hasn't yet been released. It's been more than a few months, and here we are still without a release. This was certainly a failing on my end, and I hope that for the remainder of CakeFest, I have enough time to bring it over the finish line. That said, that's all I've got. If we've got any questions, I'm happy to answer them. I'm going to check Slack right now because this is in the background for me. Cool. Doesn't look like we have any questions. So great. Thanks for joining me on this talk. And if there are any questions, I'm happy to answer them after the fact, and I'll post my slides online. Thank you, everyone.